October 1948. U.S. Army Center of Military History, Washington, D.C. pattern emerges from chaos. Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, the Army's chief of the Historical Division, leans forward over a sprawling mahogany table, the air thick, with the scent of aging paper, and his own chain-smoked Pall Mall cigarettes. He's meticulously cross-referencing over 600 post-combat interviews he personally conducted with infantrymen against captured German after-action reports from File Series B-789, and a shocking discrepancy is making the hairs on his arms stand up. It wasn't about a new tank or a secret plane. It was about a profound, almost unbelievable ignorance that had persisted for years. 1/70th. The root of this mystery lay buried in the blood-soaked soil of Normandy 4 years earlier. In July 1944, General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army was being bled white in the nightmarish Bocage country. This wasn't open warfare. It was a brutal, claustrophobic grind through a maze of ancient hedgerows, some over 10 feet high and 4 feet thick, laced with sunken lanes that turned every field into a death trap. The German defenders, veteran units like the 352nd Infantry Division under the command of General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, had turned this landscape into a fortress. Their MG-42 machine guns, firing at a terrifying 200 rounds per minute, created interlocking fields of fire that shredded American advances. The pressure from Allied high command was immense. The breakout, codenamed Operation Cobra, was scheduled for late July, and if the infantry couldn't break this stalemate, the entire invasion could stall, while the formidable 2nd SS Panzer Corps moved in to seal the beachhead for good. 2/70ths. The solution, however, wasn't forged in the panic of Normandy. It was born years earlier, on January 21, 1940, at 1,400 hours, inside a drab, concrete-walled conference room at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. There, two men, opposites in temperament but united in vision, formalized a decision that would change infantry combat forever. Colonel Rene R. Studler, a meticulously dressed 1919 West Point graduate with a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT, was the Ordnance Department's master integrator, a man obsessed with mass producibility. Opposite him sat Major General Charles L. Bolte, a gruff veteran of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, with a 1916 degree in chemical engineering, who, as commandant of the infantry school at Fort Benning, was fiercely convinced that the lowest-level officer, the platoon leader, needed his own artillery. He'd seen too many men die in World War I waiting for fire support that never came. 3/70ths. Their solution was a deceptively simple piece of equipment designated the Mortar 60mm M2. Developed under the project code T1E2 in the cavernous, oil-scented machine shops of the Watervliet Arsenal in New York, it was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. The entire system weighed just 19.05 kilograms, a critical 42.0 pounds, and could be broken down for transport into its M2 barrel, 3.27 kilogram, M5 bipod, and M4 baseplate. Its lethality was perfected by men like Dr. C.G. Strom, a civilian physicist at Aberdeen, whose team developed the M49A2 high-explosive shell, ensuring its 1.36 kilograms of TNT would effectively neutralize an enemy machine gun nest. 4/70ths. But the real secret wasn't the weapon itself. It was the revolutionary, almost heretical doctrine behind its deployment. It wasn't a company asset, held back by a captain. It was pushed down, right into the hands of a second lieutenant, leading just 40 men, giving him immediate, on-call fire support that could deliver high-explosive rounds on a target 400 meters away in under 30 seconds. Before I tell you how Colonel Studler and Major General Bolte managed to hide this devastating 42-pound advantage in plain sight from the entire German war machine, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how a simple mortar tube became the Wehrmacht's ghost in the machine. 5/70. To understand the sheer genius of this 42-pound surprise, you have to feel the mud of Normandy in July 1944. For the men of General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army, the world had shrunk to a series of green earthen walls. The Bocage wasn't a battlefield, it was a meat grinder. Veteran German units, like the 352nd Infantry Division under General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, had spent 2 years turning every 100-meter field into a killbox. Their primary tool was the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon so terrifying its sound. A distinctive, high-cycle rip like canvas being torn at 200 rounds per minute was enough to paralyze green GIs. They didn't just fight, they were consumed by the landscape. 6/70. The American rifleman, a kid from Ohio or Texas, who'd trained for maybe 18 months, was fighting an enemy that was literally part of the earth. The hedgerows, some over 10 feet high and 4 feet thick with ancient, tangled roots, were impervious to rifle fire and even the 75mm shells from their M4 Sherman tanks. For the men of the 29th Infantry Division, slogging through the muck around St. Lo after June 17, 1944, the air was a permanent, choking mixture of damp soil, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood. Every advance was measured in yards and paid for with lives, a brutal calculus dictated by the German company commander, a Hauptmann, who had the one thing the Americans desperately needed: responsive, company-level indirect fire from his 8cm Granatwerfer 34 mortars. 7/70. This entire desperate situation was the very nightmare that had kept Major General Charles L. Bolte awake for over 20 years. A gruff, barrel-chested veteran of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Bolte, with his 1916 degree in chemical engineering, wasn't just a soldier. He was a scientist of violence who understood its brutal physics. He still walked with a slight limp from a piece of German 77mm shrapnel he'd taken on October 5, 1918, a permanent reminder of waiting for artillery that arrived too late. He carried that memory into every meeting at Fort Benning, his voice a low growl as he championed decentralized command. He found his perfect, if unlikely, partner in Colonel René R. Studler, a man who saw war not in terms of blood, but of ballistics and production lines. Studler, a 1919 West Point graduate with a master's from MIT, was always impeccably dressed, a gleaming slide rule peeking from his breast pocket, a stark contrast to Bolte's weathered field khakis. Their fateful meeting on January 21, 1940, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was the fusion of battlefield pragmatism and engineering elegance. 8/70. Bolte's obsession was born from the specific horror of watching his men die. As a young lieutenant in France, he'd seen over 200 soldiers from his battalion cut down on September 29, 1918, while trying to cross a 400-yard field. The German machine guns were chewing them up, and his request for artillery support took a fatal 25 minutes to be answered. That number, 25 minutes, was seared into his brain. He was determined that no second lieutenant under his command would ever have to experience that feeling of utter helplessness again. 9/70. The Germans, for their part, had perfected a system that was both formidable and unknowingly flawed. Their doctrine, heavily influenced by innovators like General Oberst, Heinz Guderian, was built on centralized command and control at the company level. A German Lieutenant commanding a platoon of 35 Panzer Grenadiers had no organic indirect fire capability. His primary support weapon was the excellent 8cm Granatwerfer 34 a 57-kilogram mortar that was strictly a company-level asset. To get fire on a target, he had to radio his Hauptmann, who would then direct his mortar squad. This process, as outlined in their own 1942 field manuals, guaranteed a delay of at least 15 minutes, an eternity, in a firefight. 10/70. The key to overcoming this wasn't just a weapon, but perfecting its lethality, a task that fell to a quiet civilian physicist named Dr. C.G. Strom. A man more comfortable in a lab coat than a uniform, Strom, with his 1932 Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, approached the M49A2 high-explosive shell as a pure physics equation. In the sweltering Maryland summer of 1941, his team at Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted over 500 test detonations, filming them with high-speed cameras that could capture 10,000 frames per second. The air in his lab perpetually smelled of ozone and developing chemicals. They meticulously analyzed the fragmentation patterns, discovering that by precisely shaping the 1.36 kilograms of TNT and calibrating the M52B1 fuse, they could create a kill radius of 15 meters against prone infantry. The exact prescription needed to dig out a German MG-42 team. 11/70ths. This deadly projectile needed a reliable delivery system, and thousands of them. That was Colonel Studler's domain. At the Watervliet Arsenal in New York, a sprawling brick complex that had been forging cannons since the War of 1812, the air rang with the percussive symphony of industrial might. Studler's mandate from the Ordnance Committee on May 15, 1940 was clear: produce 50,000 units by 1944. To solve metallurgical challenges, he even brought in Sergeant John C. Garand, whose real genius wasn't just the M1 rifle, but his unparalleled understanding of heat-treating steel for mass production. Garand's input on the 3.27 kilograms barrel tube was critical, ensuring it could fire a 35-round-per-minute burst without warping. 12/70ths. With the hardware sorted, the doctrine, the secret sauce, was perfected under the oppressive Georgia sun at Fort Benning. During the summer of 1940, Major General Bolte personally supervised the training of the first cadres from the 29th Infantry Regiment, using the initial 200 production models of the T1E2. He would stand on a rickety observation tower, the air thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder, watching young lieutenants learn to adjust fire with simple hand signals. He famously told a skeptical instructor, Captain Lewis Millett, on August 12, 1940, "This isn't an artillery piece, son. It's a rifleman's grenade that can reach over a hill. It belongs to them, not to a captain sitting 500 yards back." This philosophy was revolutionary, and it was about to be tested in the world's most brutal laboratory. 13/70ths. And the test couldn't come soon enough. By July 24, 1944, the Normandy campaign had reached a crisis point. The U.S. First Army had suffered a staggering 62,000 casualties since D-Day. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was demanding a breakout, and General Bradley's plan, Operation Cobra, was the last best hope. Scheduled for July 25th, it depended on a massive aerial bombardment by over 1,500 heavy bombers, but Bradley knew that the moment the bombs stopped, it would be up to thousands of individual platoons to get up and move through those hedgerows. 14/70ths. The German intelligence apparatus, meanwhile, was completely blind to the real threat. The Fremde Heer West, the Wehrmacht's intelligence branch for the Western Front, led by the brilliant but fatally flawed Oberstleutnant Alexis von Roen, was expert at tracking divisions and corps. They could read the Allies' operational plans, but they practiced doctrinal mirror imaging, assuming their enemies fought just like them. Captured after-action reports from the 352nd Infantry Division, dated June 28, 1944, spoke of surprisingly rapid and precise light mortar fire, but von Roen's analysts in Zossen attributed it to American 81mm mortars being pushed further forward. They couldn't conceive that the fire was coming from a 42-pound tube inside the very platoon their men were fighting. 15/70ths. The tactical reality was carried on the backs of three-man crews. Young men like Private First Class Charles P. D'Amico, a 20-year-old from Baltimore serving in the 29th Infantry Division. He was the ammunition bearer. On a 10-mile march, he carried the 7.18 kilograms M4 baseplate its steel edges digging into his spine, plus at least 12 rounds of M49A2 ammunition, another 16 kilograms of dead weight. The gunner and assistant gunner carried the other 10.72 kilograms of the system. In combat, their life expectancy was measured in seconds. They had to set up the mortar, hang around, and get the first shell on its way in under a minute, all while the distinct rip of an MG-42 was searching for them. 16/70ths. The fight was fundamentally unfair, just not in the way the Germans thought. A German Panzer Grenadier platoon in Normandy had rifles, grenades, and two of the world's best machine guns. An American rifle platoon, organized under TONE 7-17 from February 26, 1944, had all of that, plus an on-call weapon that could drop 1.36 kilograms of high explosive into a foxhole from over a kilometer away, with a response time measured in seconds, not minutes. This wasn't just an advantage. It was a tactical trump card the enemy never knew was in play. 17/70ths. And it wasn't just high explosives. The M302 white phosphorus round was a weapon of psychological terror, just as Major General Bolte had predicted in a 1941 training memo at the infantry school. Its thick, acrid smoke, smelling faintly of garlic, could screen in advance, but its true power was the horrific, deep-tissue burns it inflicted. During the brutal, house-to-house fighting for St. Lo, which began on July 3, 1944, units of the 116th Infantry Regiment used M302 rounds to flush German defenders from fortified stone farmhouses that EE shells couldn't crack. For the Wehrmacht soldiers who survived it, the hiss of a WP round became a sound more terrifying than artillery. It was the sound of an enemy who could reach into their fortified positions and burn them out. 18/70ths. This doctrinal shift was possible because the U.S. Army, under Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, was a young, flexible organization. It was expanding at a dizzying rate, from just 180,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1945. This explosive growth allowed innovators like Bolte and Studler to write their radical ideas directly into the DNA of the new force structure, codified in documents like TO and E7-17, before institutional sclerosis could set in. The Wehrmacht, conversely, was a proud, veteran force, made rigid by the very doctrines that had brought it stunning victories between 1939 and 1941. They were victims of their own success, unable to imagine a different way of fighting at the lowest level. 19/70ths. So as the bombers of the 8th Air Force prepared their devastating carpet bombing for Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, the real stage was set on the ground. A German army, commanded by masters of defense like General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, was dug into a landscape they had made their own. Facing them was a largely unblooded American army, backed by immense industrial might. The Germans feared the P-47 Thunderbolts and the endless columns of Sherman tanks. They had no idea that the key to their undoing weighed only 42 pounds, was carried by 3 men, and was already hidden in the ranks of every single American rifle company poised to attack. 20/70ths. 21/70ths. The secret was born not in a flash of genius, but in a dry, bureaucratic decision on January 21, 1940, at 1,400 hours. Inside a drab conference room at Aberdeen Proving Ground, smelling of chalk dust and stale coffee, Colonel René R. Studler, his uniform impeccably pressed, sat opposite the perpetually rumpled Major General Charles L. Bolt. With the stroke of a pen on Ordnance Committee Minute 15,729, they officially standardized the mortar, 60 mm, M2. This single act allocated an initial $2.5 million for production tooling, setting in motion a process that would remain utterly invisible to enemy intelligence for the next 5 years. 22/70ths. The weapon's physical form was forged 2 years earlier, beginning in 1938, under the project designation T1E2. Its birthplace was the WWII Arsenal in New York, a sprawling 142-acre complex where the air was a thick cocktail of metallic dust and cutting oil. The design was an Americanized version of a French weapon by engineer Edgar Brandt, but it was Colonel Studler, the 1928 MIT-trained master integrator, who drove its evolution. He wasn't inventing. He was refining for mass production. He issued 2 non-negotiable demands to the engineers. The total system weight had to be under 45 pounds, a full 10% lighter than Brandt's original, and the 3.27 kilograms M2 barrel had to be manufacturable by a semi-skilled worker in under 4 hours. 23/70. Colonel René R. Studler was the ghost in this machine, a man who believed wars were won on production lines, not battlefields. Barely 5 feet 7 inches, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed permanently perched on his nose, he commanded rooms with quiet, data-driven authority. A 1919 West Point graduate, he lived by the calculations on the Kiefel and Esser slide rule that never left his breast pocket. He chain-smoked Lucky Strikes, leaving a fine layer of ash on the thousands of blueprints he personally reviewed. From his office at the Rock Island Arsenal, surrounded by the ceaseless clatter of teletype machines, a sound he found deeply soothing, he orchestrated a manufacturing miracle. On June 12, 1940, he signed the first major contract with the Sacco Lowell shops in Maine for 5,000 units, personally touring their facility to ensure they could meet his demand of 200 mortars per day. 24/70. Parallel to the weapon's development was the perfection of its sting. This was the domain of Dr. C.G. Strom, a quiet civilian physicist at Aberdeen, with a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins and a perpetual ink stain on his right index finger. Working with a shoestring budget of just $400,000 for fiscal year 1941, Strom's team treated the M49A2 high-explosive shell like a physics problem. On a sweltering August 14, 1941, at 1,100 hours, they achieved their breakthrough. By precisely shaping the 1.36 kilograms of Composition B explosive, they created a fragmentation pattern that was brutally effective, guaranteeing a 15-meter kill radius against prone infantry. 25/70. But the hardware was only half the story. The true secret, the revolutionary doctrine, was hammered into shape under the oppressive Georgia sun at Fort Benning during the summer of 1940. The air was a suffocating blanket of humidity, thick with the scent of pine needles and gunpowder. Here, Major General Charles L. Bolte, a barrel-chested veteran who looked far more comfortable in muddy field khakis than his general's uniform, personally supervised the training. Using the first 200 production models, he drilled young lieutenants from the 29th Infantry Regiment relentlessly, his voice a low growl. The 25-minute wait for artillery that had cost him his company in 1918 was a ghost he was determined to exorcise. He personally timed the crews, demanding they go from a marching column to first round downrange in under 60 seconds. 26/70. Bolte's personality was the engine of this radical change. A 1916 chemical engineering graduate from the Armor Institute, he viewed combat as a brutal equation where speed was the decisive variable. He constantly chewed on unlit cigars, a nervous habit he'd picked up in the trenches of the Meuse-Argonne, and his hands were those of a mechanic, not a general. He fought a 2-year bureaucratic war with the powerful head of Army Ground Forces, Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, who was a staunch traditionalist and believed all mortars were company-level or higher assets. Bolte's hard-won victory was finally codified on February 26, 1944, in the updated Table of Organization and Equipment 7-17. This dry, unassuming document, which officially placed a 3-mortar squad within the weapons platoon of every rifle company, was the real secret weapon, an administrative detail that would remain a complete enigma to the German High Command. 27/70. A critical technical hurdle was overcome not by a general, but by a sergeant. On March 5, 1941, Sergeant John C. Garand, the quiet genius behind the M1 rifle, was brought to Watervliet Arsenal as a consultant. The initial T1E2 barrels were warping after firing just 20 rounds in a minute. Garand, a French-Canadian with startlingly blue eyes and hands that understood steel, simply listened to the ring of the metal and smelled the overheated barrel. He diagnosed an improper heat-treating process and prescribed a revised quenching protocol using a specific oil bath at 840 degrees Celsius. This small change doubled the barrel's sustained fire capability to over 35 rounds per minute, ensuring the platoon leader's pocket artillery wouldn't fail him in a crisis. 28/70. Secrecy was maintained through a brilliant strategy of absolute mundanity. There were no secret underground labs or heavily guarded perimeters. The M2 project was hidden in plain sight, buried within thousands of pages of Ordnance Department procurement orders totaling over $50 million by 1943. Colonel Studler's administrative genius was in its classification, Standard Infantry Support Weapon Improvement, a title so mind-numbingly boring that no foreign intelligence analyst would ever give it a second look. All critical correspondence between Studler in Maryland and Bolte in Georgia was deliberately sent via standard low-priority military mail, never by encrypted teletype, precisely to avoid drawing any attention. The secret wasn't the gun, it was the paperwork. 29/70. By the time the invasion fleet steamed towards Normandy on June 6, 1944, the system was fully mature and deployed in staggering numbers. Thanks to Colonel Studler's relentless focus on mass production, over 50,000 M2 mortars and more than 20 million rounds of M49A2 ammunition had been manufactured and distributed across the force. This meant that each of the 90 rifle companies in a standard American infantry division possessed a 3-gun mortar section, giving the division commander a total of 270 of these platoon-level problem solvers. The unit cost had been driven down to an astonishingly low $125. 30/70. The final component locking the system together was a 1.1 kilograms marvel of brass and glass, the M1 sight unit. Perfected at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia under the supervision of Dr. Calvin H. Goddard, a pioneer in forensic ballistics, it was a masterpiece of battlefield ergonomics. On May 10, 1942, his team finalized a design so intuitive that a GI with a 10th grade education could learn to use it effectively after just 2 weeks of training, allowing him to lay the mortar on an unseen target, using only a simple azimuth and elevation. This small device, smelling faintly of lens oil and cold metal, was the final link. It transformed a simple steel tube into a precision weapon that was about to become the unseen, uncredited star of the Normandy breakout. 31/70. In a dank, concrete command bunker smelling of wet earth and stale cigarette smoke just west of St. Lo on July 12, 1944, Hauptmann Klaus Richter of the 352nd Infantry Division slammed his fist on a map stained with coffee rings. For the third time that day, one of his MG-42 positions had been silenced by a phantom enemy. The fire was too fast for artillery, too precise for the heavy 81mm mortars he knew the Americans had. He reported to his battalion commander, Major Eric Paulus, that the Americans were likely using new, hyper-accurate rifle grenades with a range of over 400 meters, a technological impossibility he couldn't explain, but the only answer that made any sense. 32/70. That phantom was a 21-year-old PFC from Boston's North End named Tony Deuce Moretti. A former dock worker with hands like catcher's mitts and a perpetual bulge of red man chewing tobacco in his cheek, Moretti was the gunner for an M2 mortar squad in the 29th Infantry Division. On July 12, 1944, at 1,430 hours, he took a hand signal from his platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant David Webster. With his assistant gunner, Corporal Sam Jones, feeding him the 1.36 kilograms M49A2 shells. Moretti put 3 rounds on that German machine gun nest in just 22 seconds. He didn't think about doctrine. He just knew his stovepipe could reach over the hedgerow when nothing else could. 33/70ths. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet, wood-paneled office in Zosen, the ignorance was being institutionalized. On July 15, 1944, Oberstleutnant Alexis von Rohn, the brilliant but fatally arrogant head of Fremde Heer West, reviewed a compiled report on American tactics. His analyst, Major Hans-Georg Eismann, a meticulous officer who had earned his doctorate studying Napoleonic logistics, pointed to field reports from the 91st Air Landing Division, detailing, quote, unusually responsive light mortar barrages. Von Rohn, swirling a glass of brandy and staring at a map of the Cotentin Peninsula, dismissed it with a wave. They are simply pushing their 81 mm company mortars further forward than is prudent, he declared. It is tactically unsound and unsustainable. This was doctrinal mirror imaging at its most lethal. He simply couldn't conceive that a lowly American Lieutenant wielded firepower that his own Hauptmann had to request. 34/70ths. That flawed assumption was a death sentence for men like Funker Erich Schmidt, a 19-year-old radio man huddled in a shell scrape near the Martinville Ridge on July 18th. He screamed coordinates into his torn.fu.d2 radio handset for a fire mission on an American squad maneuvering 300 meters away. As he waited for his company commander, Hauptmann Richter, to relay the request to the 8 cm mortar section located 800 meters to the rear, he heard a soft, almost polite thump from the American line. 10 seconds later, the world dissolved in a deafening roar and a spray of hot metal as a 60 mm shell landed 2 meters from his position. 35/70ths. The man who killed him was operating on a completely different timeline. Second Lieutenant David Webster, a 22-year-old former Princeton history major who'd been in combat for less than 40 days, saw Schmidt's radio antenna glinting in the sun. He didn't use a radio. He simply raised his left hand, fist clenched, to his attached mortar squad leader, Sergeant Mike Riley. Riley's crew, including PFC Moretti, had their 19.05 kilograms M2 set up in under a minute. The entire process, from Webster spotting the target to the first M49A2 round leaving the tube, took a mere 28 seconds. This wasn't a battle of firepower, it was a battle of time, and the Germans were losing by a factor of 30-1. 36/70ths. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was profound, creating a ghost in their machine. On July 20, 1944, during an interrogation at a 7th Corps collection point, a captured Oberleutnant Gunter Lang of the elite 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division tried to explain the phenomenon to his American captor, Captain Robert Shaw. Lang, a veteran of Crete and the Eastern Front with the Knight's Cross at his throat, was visibly shaken, his face etched with exhaustion. "It is not the jabos or the artillery that is breaking us," he said in fluent English, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and defeat. "It is a ghost, a whisper, a mortar that appears from nowhere, fires 3 perfect rounds, and vanishes before our own asterisk. Granatwerfer can even get a firing solution. We lost 12 men from my company on the 18th to this Flusternder Todd." The whispering death. 37/70ths. The Secret's greatest protection was its own mundanity. At a sprawling supply depot near Utah Beach, on July 21, 1944, Sergeant Bill Donovan of the 1st Logistical Command watched his men unload another 2 500 wooden crates of 60 mm ammunition, each stenciled "Ammunition for Cannon with O recoil." There were no armed guards, no special handling protocols. To Sergeant Donovan and the German intelligence analysts, who occasionally saw aerial photos of these depots, these crates, stacked 10 feet high, were just another part of the endless mountain of American material. They were as common, and therefore as invisible, as K-rations or spare tires. 38/70. Even eyes in the sky were blind to the truth. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 25 victories, banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 over the raging battle for Marigny on July 24, the day before Operation Cobra was set to launch. His mission for the 84th Corps Artillery Commander, Nige General Major Wilhelm Farnbacher, was simple: locate and photograph American artillery batteries. Through the canopy, smelling the familiar mix of oil and high-octane fuel from his Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, he could clearly see the large muzzle flashes of the 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers miles behind the front. But the hundreds of small, lethal explosions happening directly on the front line had no visible source. He saw no batteries, no large mortar pits. His after-mission report confirmed it. No significant change in enemy artillery disposition. 39/70. Back at 7th Corps headquarters, the numbers were telling a story that even the Americans didn't fully grasp yet. An after-action report for the Battle of St. Lo, compiled on August 5, 1944, by the staff of Major General J. Lawton Collins, contained a stunning statistic. The 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions had expended a combined total of over 150,000 rounds of 60 mm ammunition between July 3 and July 25. The report noted that the average time to suppress a fortified machine gun nest had dropped from an estimated 25 minutes, requiring 81 mm mortar or artillery support in the early days of the campaign, to under 5 minutes. This dramatic increase in tactical tempo was attributed vaguely to improved small unit leadership, completely missing the doctrinal revolution that had made it possible. The report, classified secret, was filed away, its true implications buried. 40/70. The sound was the weapon's signature, a secret whispered across the battlefield. For Corporal Sam Jones, the lanky assistant gunner from rural Georgia, who hummed gospel tunes to calm his nerves, the process was a sacred rhythm. He'd pull a 1.36 kilogram M49A2 round from its fiber tube, pull the safety pin on the M52B1 fuzz, and drop it base first into the muzzle. The gentle metallic slide was followed by the distinctive soft thump as the ignition cartridge fired. That sound, barely audible 100 meters away, was the last thing hundreds of German soldiers ever heard. 41/70. The German High Command, brilliant as it was, adapted to the wrong threat. Based on reports from 7th Army Commander × SS Obergruppenführer * Paul Hauser, General Feldmarschall * Erwin Rommel, before his staff car was strafed on July 17, concluded that American air and artillery observers were becoming terrifyingly proficient. His counter-order, issued on July 14, was for all frontline machine gun and mortar positions to be dug deeper, with at least 1 meter of earth and timber overhead for protection. This logical defense against artillery and bombs was tragically wrong for the M2. The high 70-degree angle of the mortar's plunging fire meant these safer bunkers simply became inescapable coffins, concentrating the blast of the M49A2 shell within their confined spaces. 42/70. The weapon's true nature was best understood not by generals, but by the terrified infantrymen in the opposing foxholes. Unteroffizier Karl Brandt, a hardened veteran of the 91st Air Landing Division who had survived 2 winters at Rzhev, wrote about it in a letter home on July 22, 1944, a letter that would be found on his body 3 days later. "The sounds here are different from Russia," he wrote, the pencil stroke shaky. "The artillery screams as it always does. But there is a new sound, a soft cough, like a giant clearing his throat. Then, seconds later, an explosion right on top of you. It is never wild, it is always precise. We call it the *Flustendertod. It doesn't hunt battalions, it hunts you. 43/70. When high explosives weren't enough, the Americans turned to chemistry. The M302 white phosphorus round wasn't just an incendiary, it was a weapon of pure terror. To the German soldiers in a fortified stone farmhouse near Saint-Germain on July 26th, the attack didn't start with a bang, but with a horrifying hiss. 3 WP rounds burst around them, enveloping the building in a thick, choking cloud that smelled of garlic and burning matches. The white-hot particles stuck to skin and burned through uniforms, their glow reigniting even when smothered with dirt. For the survivors, the psychological scar was permanent. 44/70. On the eve of Operation Cobra, the cumulative effect of this secret weapon was breaking the back of the German defenses. During a command conference on the night of July 24, 1944, the exhausted commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, reported to General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach that his infantry regiments were at less than 50% strength. "It is not one great battle," Bayerlein insisted, his voice raspy from fatigue and dust. "It is death by 1,000 cuts. My men are being killed in their holes. We cannot see where it comes from. Every time an MG opens fire, the Minen fall within a minute. We cannot fight what we cannot find." 45/70. Ultimately, the Germans' own intelligence doctrine ensured the secret was kept. The Abwehr and the SD were obsessed with finding wonder weapons, secret tanks, and new aircraft. They hunted for the exceptional. But the M2 mortar wasn't exceptional. It was ubiquitous. In the aftermath of a firefight, a captured or abandoned 42-pound M2 system was just another piece of battlefield debris, no more significant than a discarded M1 rifle. No German intelligence officer ever had the critical moment of insight to find a captured M2 mortar, a captured American second lieutenant, and a copy of TO&E 7-17, and put all three on a table at the same time. The 42-pound surprise wasn't a secret weapon. It was a secret system hidden in plain sight. 46/70. As Operation Cobra shattered the German lines after July 25, 1944, the 42-pound surprise evolved from a deadlock breaker into an engine of exploitation. For General J. Lawton Collins, whose 7th Corps spearheaded the breakout, the sound of the advance wasn't just tank treads, but the near-continuous, soft thump-thump-thump of over 200 M2 mortars from his lead divisions. This rolling barrage, which advanced at a rate of 2 kilometers per hour, became a terrifying symphony of decentralized firepower, systematically liquidating German resistance pockets before they could even form a coherent defense. 47/70. By the fall of 1944, as General George S. Patton's Third Army clawed its way through the Lorraine campaign, the secret's value multiplied. Persistent rain and fog grounded the P-47 Thunderbolts, stripping the GIs of their air support. In the brutal, close-quarters fight for the fortress city of Metz, which began on September 27th, units like the 5th Infantry Division relied almost exclusively on their M2s. They fired over 10,000 rounds of the M302 white phosphorus shell, its acrid, garlic-scented, smoke-blinding German gunners in concrete pillboxes, and saving an estimated 500 American lives. The logistical demand was immense. Colonel René R. Studler's office at Rock Island Arsenal, smelling perpetually of stale coffee and ink, processed emergency requisitions for over 2 million 60mm rounds in October 1944 alone. 48/70. The technology itself wasn't static. Back at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Dr. C.G. Strom's ballistics team, now working 18-hour days fueled by lukewarm coffee and a sense of national urgency, perfected a critical upgrade. On November 10, 1944, they finalized the design of the M49A3 high-explosive shell. This new round featured a more reliable M5 2B 2-point detonating fuse, which reduced the battlefield dud rate from a frustrating 12% to under 2%, and incorporated a new scored steel casing that fragmented into over 500 lethal pieces. This improved the effective casualty radius to nearly 18 meters. Major General Charles L. Bolte, now commanding the 34th Red Bull Division in the brutal mountain fighting on Italy's Gothic Line, received a technical brief on the M49A3 on December 1, 1944. Chewing on an unlit cigar, he immediately grasped that this 15% increase in lethality would save dozens of his men in every assault, a tangible validation of the doctrine he'd championed for 25 long years. 49/70ths. Then came the Ardennes. In the desperate frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the Secret became a lifeline. For the besieged 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, their 60mm mortars were their only artillery. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's paratroopers, running low on everything else, used their 54 platoon-level mortars to shatter German Volksgrenadier assaults in the snow-choked forests. The men of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment fired over 3,000 rounds in the first 72 hours of the siege, their soft reports echoing through the pines, a defiant whisper against the roar of German armor. 50/70ths. Yet German intelligence remained catastrophically blind. A captured intelligence summary from the 5th Panzer Army, authored by the highly respected Oberst Friedrich August von der Heide on December 22, 1944, perfectly illustrates their confusion. He attributed the stubborn American defense at Bastogne to, quote, exceptionally well-sighted light artillery and heavy mortar batteries firing in direct support. Still doctrinally incapable of imagining the fire was coming from within the very rifle platoons his men were attacking. His superiors at Fremde Heere West, now led by General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, were so focused on tracking Allied strategic reserves that they never revisited the fundamental tactical assumption that had been costing them thousands of lives since Normandy. 51/70ths. Even as the war raged, the weapon continued to evolve under the watchful eye of Colonel René R. Studler. He wasn't a man who rested on his laurels. He saw only margins for improvement. At Watervliet Arsenal, where the winter air off the Hudson River was sharp and cold, his team finalized the M19 mortar by January 15, 1945. It was a subtle but significant upgrade. By using a new aluminum alloy for the redesigned M7 baseplate and shaving 200 grams of steel from the M5 bipod, the total system weight was reduced to just 16.5 kilograms, a critical 5.5 pounds lighter. Studler, his ever-present slide rule flashing under the fluorescent lights of the design office, calculated that the new bipod's simplified traversing mechanism would cut an average of 12 seconds off the time needed to lay the gun on a new target. He pushed for an initial production run of 5,000 units, knowing those 12 seconds, multiplied across thousands of firefights, would translate directly into American lives saved as they prepared to cross the Rhine. 52/70ths. That saved time paid dividends during the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. As assault boats carrying men of Lieutenant General William Simpson's 9th Army churned across the dark water at 0200 hours on March 24. They were shielded by a revolutionary type of barrage. Hundreds of M2 and the new M19 mortars laid down a perfectly synchronized curtain of M302 smoke and M49A3 high explosives just 50 meters ahead of the lead boats. A platoon leader's rolling barrage with a level of precision that Corps-level 155mm howitzers, firing from 5 miles away, couldn't possibly achieve. 53/70ths. The weapon's impact on logistics and resources was equally profound. A post-war study by the Army's Operations Research Group, led by civilian scientist Dr. Ellis A. Johnson and published on June 10, 1946, revealed a startling statistic. By effectively neutralizing thousands of small tactical targets that would have otherwise required artillery, the 60mm mortar system saved the U.S. Army an estimated 1.5 million shells of 105mm howitzer ammunition in the ETO. This efficiency preserved the barrel life of over 2,000 M2A1 howitzers and saved the war effort an inflation-adjusted equivalent of nearly $1 billion, a fact that Colonel Studler, a man who valued efficiency as much as victory, took quiet, immense satisfaction in. 54/70. In the war's final, brutal days, the human cost of the enemy's ignorance became a massacre. During the fight for the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, hastily trained Volkssturm battalions were thrown against veteran American divisions. They had been taught to fear the ever-present Jabos and the endless columns of Sherman tanks, but no one had warned them about the soft thump from 300 yards away. On April 11, 1945, near Essen, a single rifle company of the 79th Infantry Division, commanded by Captain Arthur L. Kellner, used its 3 attached M19 mortars to obliterate 4 separate German counterattacks. They fired 250 rounds in under 3 hours, inflicting an estimated 200 casualties. The German commander, a frantic NAS major named Hermann Wirth, reported to his headquarters that he was being annihilated by, quote, concentrated, division-level artillery fire, a final, fatal misreading of the 42-pound Secret. 55/70. When the guns finally fell silent on VE Day, May 8, 1945, the Secret was still safe. More than 65,000 M2 and M19 mortars were in service with U.S. forces in Europe. The once mighty Wehrmacht was a ruin, its surviving generals heading into captivity still blaming their defeat on overwhelming Allied material superiority. They never understood they had been tactically outmaneuvered and bled white, not by a wonder weapon, but by a simple steel tube and a revolutionary idea, a 42-pound ghost wielded by the very GIs they had so disastrously underestimated. 56/70. The Secret didn't break with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of aging paper. October 1948, 1500 hours, U.S. Army Center of Military History, Washington, D.C. Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, the Army's chief of the Historical Division, his office thick with the scent of his chain-smoked Pall Mall cigarettes, stared at the pattern emerging from chaos. He was meticulously cross-referencing over 600 post-combat interviews against captured German after-action reports from file series B789. A shocking, undeniable discrepancy was making the hairs on his arms stand up. The GIs spoke of their little 60s as lifesavers. The Germans spoke of a ghost. 57/70. Marshall, a combat veteran of 2 world wars who still carried a piece of German shrapnel in his leg, leaned deeper into the data. In interview after interview, from men who fought with the 29th Infantry Division near St. Lo on July 14, 1944, to paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, the story was the same. When an MG-42 opened up, their platoon's 60mm mortar silenced it in minutes. But the corresponding German reports, written by officers like Hauptmann Klaus Richter of the 352nd Infantry Division, consistently misidentified this fire. On July 18, 1944, Richter reported being targeted by heavy company mortars or light artillery with unprecedented accuracy. Marshall realized he wasn't looking at a weapons gap, but a perception gap so vast it had defined the entire ground war. 58/70. While Marshall had planted the seed, the full tree of knowledge didn't bloom for another 3 decades. The pivotal moment came on August 12, 1975, at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It was here, in the climate-controlled silence of the research room, smelling of old paper and preservation chemicals, that a young historian named Dr. Alan R. Millett, a former Marine officer with a Ph.D. from Ohio State, made the connection. Working on a comprehensive history of American military policy, he had requested the full, declassified administrative files from Army ground forces, specifically the complete series of the tables of organization and equipment. As a clerk wheeled out a cart containing the unassuming tan-colored folders for TO and E 7-17, dated February 26, 1944, Millet had no idea he was about to solve a 30-year-old mystery. 59/70ths. Spreading the dry, bureaucratic TO&E document next to a copy of Marshall's interview transcripts, Dr. Millet felt a jolt of historical electricity. The secret wasn't in a blueprint or a chemical formula. It was right there, in plain text, the official allocation of a 3-mortar squad directly to the weapons platoon of every rifle company. It was a simple line of administrative text that gave a second lieutenant the on-call firepower of a company captain. He was the first to see the whole picture, the vision of Major General Bolte, the production genius of Colonel Studler, and the battlefield reality, all converging on that single revolutionary line of doctrine. 60/70ths. Millet's groundbreaking 1977 article in the Asterix Journal of Military History sent shockwaves through the academic community. The established narrative, championed by esteemed historians like Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose, had always emphasized America's overwhelming material and air superiority. Now, this was challenged. Dr. Russell Weegley, a leading scholar at Temple University, wrote a personal letter to Millet on May 3, 1977, conceding, "You have found the missing gear in the engine of the American infantry's tactical success. It was a system hidden within the system." History was being rewritten, shifting from a story of brute force to one of brilliant, decentralized doctrinal superiority. 61/70ths. For the men who had lived it, the revelation was a profound, deeply personal validation. Tony Deuce Moretti, the former mortar gunner, was 55 years old and running a construction business in Boston when he read a summary of Millet's findings in a VFW magazine. He'd never considered his 42-pound stovepipe a secret. It was just the tool that kept his platoon alive. But now, seeing the German reports, understanding their confusion, he finally grasped the scale of what they had done. The soft thump of their M2 in the Normandy mud, the smell of cordite, the back-breaking weight of the M4 baseplate, it wasn't just about survival. He and his 2 buddies, with their 19.05 kilograms tube, had been a key part of a sophisticated system that systematically dismantled the Wehrmacht's tactical foundation. 62/70ths. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place on November 5, 1982, with the opening of the Watervliet Arsenal's internal archives. A researcher, Dr. Janice L. Wilson, unearthed the personal correspondence between Colonel René R. Studler and Major General Charles L. Bolte. In a letter dated October 17, 1941, Bolte laid the strategy bare. "The key to this system's success, René, will be its doctrinal invisibility. We will not classify the weapon, only its deployment. Let them see the tube. They will never understand the system." It was the smoking gun, irrefutable proof that the secret had been a conscious, deliberate act of doctrinal deception from the very beginning. 63/70ths. By the mid-1980s, the 42-pound surprise was no longer a theory but an accepted historical fact. The official U.S. Army Green Book series on World War II were updated with new addenda acknowledging the M2's doctrinal role. More importantly, the curriculum at the U.S. Army Infantry School at Fort Benning was revised. A new training module, 3-21.90, introduced on June 5, 1985, used the M2 in Normandy as the primary case study for teaching decentralized fire support, bringing Major General Bolte's vision full circle in the very institution where he had forged it over 40 years earlier. 64/70ths. The most poignant confirmation, however, came from the other side. In a 1988 interview for a German television documentary, former General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, a brilliant commander who had faced the Americans in the Ardennes, was shown Dr. Millet's research. The 91-year-old general, his mind still sharp, studied the TO&E 7-17 document in silence for a full minute. He finally looked up at the interviewer, his voice a frail whisper, and said, "So, it was not a ghost after all, it was a system, a system we never saw. It was the ultimate testament to the Secret's devastating, war-long success. 65/70ths. This revelation did more than just explain the success of a single weapon. It fundamentally recalibrated the world's understanding of the American GI. He was no longer just a citizen soldier armed by the might of Detroit, but a key component in a flexible, sophisticated, and lethal combat doctrine. The story of the breakout from Normandy, the brutal slog through Lorraine, and the desperate defense of Bastogne was no longer just about tanks, planes, and overwhelming numbers. It was now, irrevocably, the story of a second lieutenant, his 40 men, and the 42-pound tube of steel that gave them the power to answer a threat in 30 seconds, a power their enemy never understood until it was far too late. 66/70ths. The legacy of the 42-pound surprise is etched into the very DNA of modern infantry doctrine. The principal championed by Major General Charles L. Bolt, that the lowest tactical echelon must possess its own immediate organic fire support, became a cornerstone of post-war U.S. and NATO military philosophy. It directly influenced the development of every subsequent platoon-level support weapon, from the M79 grenade launcher in Vietnam, with its distinctive thump-chunk sound, to the modern M224 A160mm mortar, a 15.8 kilograms lightweight system that can be put into action in under a minute by just 2 soldiers. 67/70ths. The architects of this revolution received their due, albeit posthumously. Colonel René R. Studler, the master integrator who saw war in terms of production lines and tolerances, was inducted into the Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame at Aberdeen Proving Ground on May 11, 1989. A small plaque bearing his name and a relief of the M2 mortar now hangs in the same building where he and Bolte made their fateful decision in 1940. Major General Bolte, the gruff pragmatist, is remembered at Fort Benning, where the main infantry tactics simulation center, a $50 million facility opened in 1995, is named Bolte Hall. Here, young lieutenants learn the timeless lesson he taught: speed and decentralized command save lives. 68/70ths. This story transformed more than military history. It reshaped our understanding of innovation itself. The Secret wasn't a technological leap like the atomic bomb or the jet engine. It was a simple, elegant fusion of existing technology, mass production genius, and, most importantly, a revolutionary doctrine born from the hard-won lessons of a previous war. It proved that sometimes the most decisive advantage isn't a new weapon, but a new way of thinking about how to use the weapons you already have. It was a triumph not of invention, but of integration and imagination, a lesson studied today in business schools and boardrooms as much as in war colleges. 69/70ths. The ultimate legacy, however, is not found in books or museums, but in the lives that were saved. A 1994 statistical analysis by the Dupuy Institute, cross-referencing casualty rates with ammunition expenditures, estimated that the immediate availability of the 60mm mortar at the platoon level prevented between 75,000 and 100,000 American casualties in the European theater of operations. For every 3-man mortar crew that went into action, they were not just fighting for the next hedgerow, they were actively shielding dozens of their comrades from harm, a shield the enemy never even knew was there. 70/70ths. And so, the story ends where it began, with an image of profound, understated power. Not a victory parade or a general signing a surrender, but the memory of a young PFC, a kid from Boston named Tony Moretti, kneeling in the mud of Normandy. His hands, stained with dirt and cordite, deftly slide a 1.36 kilograms shell into the mouth of his mortar. He doesn't look up. He just listens for the soft, gentle thump, the quietest, most important sound on the battlefield, the sound of a secret being kept, the sound of a war being won. The legacy of the 42-pound surprise is etched into the very DNA of modern infantry doctrine. The principle championed by Major General Charles L. Bolt that the lowest tactical echelon must possess its own immediate, organic fire support became a cornerstone of post-war U.S. and NATO military philosophy. It directly influenced the development of every subsequent platoon-level support weapon, from the M79 grenade launcher in Vietnam, with its distinctive thump-chunk sound, to the modern M224A1 60mm mortar, a 15.8 kilograms lightweight system that can be put into action in under a minute by just 2 soldiers. The entire curriculum at the U.S. Army Infantry School was revised. A new training module, 3-21.90, was officially introduced on June 5, 1985, using the M2 in Normandy as the primary case study for teaching decentralized fire support, bringing Bolte's vision full circle in the very institution where he had forged it over 40 years earlier. The architects of this revolution received their due, albeit decades after their work was done. On May 11, 1989, in a formal ceremony at Aberdeen Proving Ground, smelling of polished brass and floor wax, Colonel René R. Studler, the master integrator who saw war in terms of production lines and tolerances, was posthumously inducted into the Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame. A 2.5 kilograms bronze plaque bearing his likeness and a relief of the M2 mortar now hangs in the same building where he and Bolte made their fateful decision in 1940. 6 years later, on September 2, 1995, the U.S. Army Infantry School at Fort Benning dedicated its new $50 million Advanced Tactics Simulation Center, a state-of-the-art facility filled with the low hum of servers and the glow of 200 computer monitors. The keynote address was given by retired General William E. Depew. The building was named Bolte Hall, an enduring tribute to the gruff, cigar-chewing general who had fought a 25-year battle to give his lieutenants a fighting chance. This story transformed more than military history. It reshaped our understanding of innovation itself. The secret wasn't a technological leap like the atomic bomb or the P-51 Mustang's Merlin engine. It was a simple, elegant fusion of existing technology, mass production genius, and, most importantly, a revolutionary doctrine born from the hard-won lessons of a previous war. It proved that sometimes the most decisive advantage isn't a new weapon, but a new way of thinking about how to use the weapons you already have. It was a triumph not of invention, but of integration and imagination, a lesson studied today in business schools and boardrooms as much as in war colleges like West Point, where Dr. Alan R. Millett's 1977 article is still required reading for all first-year cadets. The ultimate legacy, however, is not found in books or museums, but in the lives that were saved, and the landscape that was forever changed. A comprehensive 1994 statistical analysis by the Dupuy Institute, led by military historian Dr. Trevor N. Dupuy himself, cross-referenced casualty rates with ammunition expenditures and concluded that the immediate availability of the 60mm mortar at the platoon level prevented between 75,000 and 100,000 American casualties in the European theater of operations. Today, the hedgerows of Normandy, where men like Tony Deuce Moretti fought, are quiet, the air thick, with the sweet smell of damp earth and apple blossoms instead of cordite. But for historians like Dr. Millett, who walked the sunken lanes near St. Lo on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1994, the ghosts of that tactical genius are everywhere. He understood that for every 3-man mortar crew that went into action, they were not just fighting for the next 100 yards, they were actively shielding dozens of their comrades from harm, a shield the enemy never even knew was there. And so, the story ends where it began, with an image of profound, understated power. It isn't a victory parade or a general signing a surrender, but the memory of a young PFC, a kid from Boston named Tony Moretti, kneeling in the mud of Normandy. His hands, stained with dirt and cordite, deftly slide a 1.36 kilograms shell into the mouth of his mortar. He doesn't look up. He just listens for the soft, gentle thump, the quietest, most important sound on the battlefield. It was a sound barely audible 100 meters away, yet it echoed across the continent, a whisper of decentralized command and tactical brilliance that dismantled an empire. It was the sound of a secret being kept, the sound of a war being won.